What if the most advanced civilizations on Earth didn't collapse because of war, famine, or plague, but because they ran out of one specific rock? Around 1200 BC, something catastrophic happened. The Egyptians, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, the Babylonians, empires that had dominated the known world for over 1,000 years, all collapsed within a single generation. Their palaces burned, their trade networks vanished, their cities were abandoned. And for decades, historians blamed the usual suspects: earthquakes, invasions, volcanic eruptions. But the real cause was far more unsettling. Because these civilizations didn't fall because of what attacked them. They fell because they ran out of a single raw material. A material so critical that without it, the most powerful empires on Earth literally couldn't function. That material was tin. And without tin, there was no bronze. And without bronze, there was no civilization. Not as they knew it. To understand what happened, you first need to understand what the Bronze Age actually was. Because most people hear Bronze Age and picture something primitive: cavemen, stone tools, basic survival. That image is completely wrong. The Bronze Age was the first truly globalized era in human history. By 1200 BC, the Eastern Mediterranean wasn't a collection of isolated kingdoms. It was the world's first interconnected economy, a tightly wound web of trade routes where grain, copper, tin, and luxury goods crisscrossed thousands of miles of desert and open sea. Pull one thread and the whole thing unravels. Egypt was exporting grain. The Mycenaeans were shipping olive oil and wine. Cyprus was supplying copper by the ton, and tin, the rarest and most critical ingredient of all, was traveling from mines as far away as Afghanistan, central Turkey, and possibly even the coast of Britain, just to reach the foundries of Mesopotamia and the Levant. Now, here's the thing. Bronze wasn't just a useful metal. It was the absolute foundation of everything. Every sword, every plow blade, every axle pin, every chisel that held these civilizations together was made of bronze. Without it, you couldn't farm efficiently, you couldn't build, you couldn't arm your soldiers, you couldn't govern. Bronze was to the ancient world what microchips are to ours. It was the material that made complex civilization possible. And bronze has a problem that nobody talks about. It doesn't exist in nature. You have to manufacture it. Bronze is an alloy. You create it by combining roughly 90% copper with 10% tin in a high-temperature furnace. Mix them right, and you get a metal that's harder, sharper, and more durable than anything else available at the time. It was, without exaggeration, the most advanced technology on Earth. Now, copper was the easy part. It's relatively abundant across the Mediterranean. Cyprus, the island literally named after it, had so much copper that it became one of the wealthiest places in the ancient world. Copper was not the bottleneck. Tin was the bottleneck. Tin is one of the rarest useful metals on the planet's surface. In the entire ancient world, there were only a handful of places where you could mine it in meaningful quantities. Scattered deposits in what is now Afghanistan, a few mountain sources in central Turkey, and possibly some in Cornwall at the absolute edge of the known world. Think about that for a second. You're running an empire in Mesopotamia. Your entire civilization, your military, your agriculture, your economy, your capacity to build literally anything, depends on bronze. And the one ingredient you absolutely cannot do without has to travel thousands of miles across deserts, mountain passes, and open ocean just to reach your foundry. That is an extraordinarily fragile supply chain, and every empire in the Bronze Age was running on it simultaneously. And here's what nobody tells you about the Bronze Age. Every empire knew how fragile the system was. They tracked every single shipment on clay tablets. They sent frantic diplomatic letters begging for more tin. We've actually found these letters. They're desperate. One Hittite king wrote to a foreign ruler, and I'm paraphrasing, "Send me tin immediately. This is a matter of life and death." That's a superpower, begging for a rock. The entire system worked like a finely tuned machine. Grain moved south, tin moved west, copper moved east. Tribute and luxury goods circulated between palace economies that monitored every transaction. It was sophisticated, it was remarkably efficient, and it was balanced on a knife's edge. There's a rule in logistics that no empire has ever escaped. The more optimized the system, the more catastrophic the failure. Because the moment any single link in that chain broke, a drought, a pirate raid on a shipping lane, a political collapse in a tin-producing region, the raw materials stopped flowing. And without tin, there was no bronze. And without bronze, everything stopped. Around 1200 BC, the knife's edge finally snapped. And it didn't snap in one place, it snapped everywhere at once. Historians call this the Bronze Age collapse, and it remains one of the most catastrophic events in human history. Within roughly 50 years, nearly every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean either collapsed entirely or was reduced to a shadow of its former self. The Hittite Empire, one of the great military superpowers of the age, a kingdom that had fought Egypt to a standstill, was completely destroyed, wiped off the map. The Mycenaean palace civilization in Greece disintegrated so thoroughly that the Greeks lost the ability to write for 400 years. Egypt survived, but just barely, and never recovered its former dominance. The Kassites in Babylon fell. The great trading cities of the Levant were destroyed and abandoned. So what triggered it? This is where it gets fascinating, because there was no single cause. It was a cascade, a system failure. Climate data from tree rings and pollen cores shows that a severe, prolonged drought hit the eastern Mediterranean around this time. Harvests failed across the region. Grain, the bloodline of these palace economies, slowed to a trickle. Then came the sea peoples, waves of displaced populations who tore through the coastal shipping lanes like a wrecking ball. We still don't know exactly who they were, but we know exactly what they did. They severed the arteries of Bronze Age commerce. The maritime routes that carried tin and copper between kingdoms were disrupted, raided, and eventually abandoned. And then the dominoes started falling. Picture a line of dominoes stretching from Afghanistan to Egypt. Each domino is a trade route, a harvest, a shipping lane. For centuries, they all stood perfectly upright, and then, within a few decades, they all went down. When the grain stopped, kingdoms couldn't feed their populations. When the trade routes collapsed, the tin stopped arriving. When the tin stopped, the foundries went cold. When the foundries went cold, there were no new weapons, no new tools, no new infrastructure. The entire technological foundation of the ancient world depended on a supply chain that stretched thousands of miles. And when that chain broke, these civilizations didn't just decline, they didn't just weaken, they went backwards. They regressed in technology by centuries. What followed wasn't a decline, it was an erasure. In Mycenaean Greece, people didn't just lose their cities, they lost the ability to read and write. The entire writing system, Linear B, vanished within a single generation. It took the Greeks roughly 400 years to reinvent literacy from scratch, this time borrowing an alphabet from the Phoenicians. 400 years of silence. That is the cost of a broken supply chain. Population centers that had housed tens of thousands of people were abandoned. The archaeological record shows a dramatic collapse in building quality, craftsmanship, and trade goods. People went from living in multi-story palace complexes to small, scattered farming villages in the hills. And here's the part that connects directly to the logistics of power. The technology didn't regress because people became stupid. It regressed because the supply chain regressed. Without access to tin, smiths couldn't forge bronze. Communities that had relied on bronze tools for centuries were forced back to using stone and bone implements. Not because they forgot how to make bronze, the knowledge still existed, but because the one critical ingredient was now stranded on the other side of a collapsed trade network. Think about that. A world where people know exactly how to build the technology they need, but physically cannot because the raw material is unreachable. That's not ignorance. That's not laziness. That's logistics. It was the ancient world's version of a chip shortage. The knowledge existed, the demand existed, the infrastructure had existed, but the supply chain was dead. And without the chain, the knowledge was worthless. Now, you might be thinking, that was 3,000 years ago. Surely we've solved this problem. We haven't. We like to believe that we've evolved past this kind of fragility. We have container ships the size of city blocks. We have GPS-tracked global logistics networks monitored in real time by algorithms. We have redundancy built into our systems. But in 2021, a single container ship got stuck sideways in the Suez Canal, one of the oldest and most critical trade choke points on Earth, a waterway that hasn't fundamentally changed its strategic importance since the Bronze Age. And within days, the global economy started buckling. Billions of dollars in goods were delayed. Factory production lines on the other side of the planet ground to a halt because components couldn't arrive. In 2020, a pandemic disrupted semiconductor supply chains so severely that car manufacturers, trillion-dollar industries, couldn't build vehicles because they were missing chips the size of a fingernail. The knowledge was there, the factories were there, but the raw material flow was broken. Sound familiar? The Bronze Age collapse teaches us something deeply uncomfortable. The more sophisticated your civilization becomes, the more dependent it is on long, fragile, invisible supply chains. And the more dependent you are on those chains, the harder you fall when they break. You're probably watching this on a device that contains over 30 rare earth minerals sourced from multiple continents. If even one of those supply chains broke permanently, your phone would be the last one you'd ever own. We didn't learn the lesson 3,000 years ago, and we still haven't learned it now. We just made the supply chains longer, more complex, and more invisible, which means when they break again, and they will, the fall will be proportionally larger. The greatest empires of the ancient world didn't fall to invading armies. They didn't crumble because their people were weak or their leaders were incompetent. They collapsed because a rock stopped arriving. A rock. That's all it took to end 1,000 years of civilization. Because it turns out that the real foundation of power was never the palaces, the armies, or the gods. It was the invisible chain of raw materials that connected mine to foundry, foundry to forge, forge to sword, sword to empire. Break the chain, and the empire follows. If you find yourself thinking differently about the invisible systems that hold our world together, consider subscribing. The Logistics of Power is dedicated to uncovering the hidden mechanisms that quietly decide which civilizations rise and which disappear. Now here's a question worth thinking about. When our modern supply chains inevitably face their next breaking point, what will our missing rock be? Lithium? Cobalt? Rare earth minerals buried under a single country's territory? Leave your theory in the comments.